Hello, everybody. Thank you once again for clicking on this podcast and coming here to listen to another data story. Today, we'll be talking about inflation in Nigeria. Why did I decide to write about inflation in Nigeria or analyze inflation in Nigeria? Well, because I'm Nigerian to begin with, and secondly, because I think it's very interesting to provide relevant data and contextualize the inflation that is currently happening in Nigeria. As at March, 2024, inflation in Nigeria was around 30 something percent. That is actually very worrying. And for me, I wanted to understand, where are we coming from, and where are we going technically. So that's literally what this podcast is going to be talking about, the data story. I'm contextualizing the entire thing, looking all the way back from 2006, and I go quite deep, in different stages all the way till now, 2024. I believe that by the time you're done listening to this podcast and this episode, you will actually be able to have conversations with people about inflation in the country and interest rates, MPR, the monetary policy rates, in such a way that you will actually sound like you know what you're talking about, right? I'm sure you talk to so many people about so many things, and you just know that, this guy is just blabbing, there's really, it's just superficial. But once you begin to talk from a data-driven perspective, once you begin to talk with proper analysis, with proper context, referencing certain periods, right, then the conversation changes, and then, even the thinking around solutions will begin to change. So, join me on this journey to learn about the story about inflation in Nigeria. If you are listening to this and you want to also have, a copy to read or have by the side, well, you can either watch my LinkedIn page and you will find the actual story that is written down, because I always write my data stories down and then I tell the story over podcast for emphasis, and also for people who might prefer listening to stories rather than reading such stories. So if you want to do that for this particular inflation data story, head over to my LinkedIn page, Musa Obed, and find the data story available for you there. Check my project section in my LinkedIn page. All the things I've written tend to be there, so that should also be where you'll find this particular story. But anyways, without further ado, let's actually get into this. Number one, let's start with context, right? And of course, I already explained that I want to tell you about inflation, and honestly, sometimes inflation feels like magic, like dark magic, Kenneth Okonkwo and Kanayo kind of magic, bro. It is, very, very interesting in Nigeria, because at the end of the day, inflation in Nigeria in the past several years has shown us that economics is real, even if you not study it in secondary school. The economy will touch you in one way or the other. But where can we start when we're talking about inflation? We can say we want to start from May 29th. That's 2003. It is the presidential inauguration day, and Nigeria's new president is about to be sworn in, and he will swear that he will govern Nigeria to the best of his ability. But does the inflation story really start there? No, the story starts way back, before the Fourth Republic, before the Third Republic, before the Second Republic. Even before the First Republic, around independence. We can really start the story somewhere around January 1914, where Lord Lugard is cemented in Nigeria's history. I apologize because I'm actually going to take a while to present the historical overview, but I promise you that you need to have this background. If not, you won't be able to get every other thing that I will talk about subsequently in this podcast. Why am I starting from 1914? Well, primarily because I want to go as far back as it's relevant. I mean, if I go beyond 1914, honestly, this podcast will be too long. And to be a bit irrelevant, mostly because the data is also not as reliable. 1940 is also the right place to look at because it is actually the point where we can actually talk about an economic history of Nigeria. And yes, the economy also has a history. And I hope that a time will come where we're able to talk about like civil wars that exist in the economy. If you're wondering what do you mean by civil wars that exist in the economy, like when like oil won the war over agriculture in the 1970s, conceptually. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's get the story in a chronological way. Why? Because context is key. What is inflation, Sha? Let's start from there, right? Inflation is simply the rise in the price of goods and services in any economy. Your ewa going used to be 200 naira, but Mama Tunde now sells it at 400 naira. Welcome to inflation. You want to get iPhone 12 and it goes from 400,000 naira to 700,000 naira. Welcome to inflation. Like I said, inflation is like black magic. It's like Kanayo is pulling the strings from somewhere. It's like another wonder of the world, honestly. We know that compound interest is quite interesting, but inflation is, in my opinion, equally interesting. And inflation happens because of economics. Yes, that subject in school that you refuse to learn and study, because you thought that you will not need it in your final WAEC. Well, look at you now, eh? They are being forced to learn economics by force. At the end of the day, despite what like different people might tell you about inflation, the basic truth is that demand and supply affects inflation. Inflation is important as a concept because the idea of central banks was created somewhat because of inflation. And let me just give you a history about central banks. Yes, there was a point where central banks did not exist, as it were, and the first central bank in the world was created in 1668 in Sweden. The Riksbank, which is the first central bank, was conceived when the Swedish chancellor, as at that point, Axel Osterna, proposed that the setting up of a bank in every Swedish town was necessary so that the Swedish money, which was the Swedish copper and standard coins in the 17th century, could circulate more quickly and allow trade to flow, stimulate trade. What happens if there were no coins in the Swedish society and in those communities? Well, inflation. How? Because the lack of coins will make whatever goods were available much more expensive, because more people will be demanding for the goods. And if that is the case, well, the people that actually have the coins will be the ones to get the goods. I don't know if you understand what I'm trying to say. So basically, inflation, right? If too many people want something, right, the prices will go up, and literally increases in prices is what causes inflation. So in this sense, like this created a sort of like a transactional theory of evolution. You know what I mean? When you think about it, but wait, don't really think about it. Okay, now I know you're thinking about it. Anyways, let's just go back to inflation in Nigeria. So in 1914, something important happened, right? Somewhere in Delta State of Kogi State, the village rulers are there with their children and their wives, and they have no idea that they have been married territorially, right? They have been mixed, north and the south. The way that the logic of 1915 worked, is as follows. The northern region of Nigeria as a location, much of which, geopolitically speaking, are the northern areas in Nigeria today, was connected with the southern region of Nigeria, much of which are the geopolitical southern areas in Nigeria today. And for the record, I want to state that if you want to get a proper understanding of this situation, you should go and read What Britain Did to Nigeria by Maximilian. I don't know the guy. The guy is not sponsoring this, so you're good to go. You're fine, right? I'm just talking about the book because I think the book lays a proper foundation for actually understanding Nigeria, not just politically, but also somehow economically. Also because the book, like What Britain Did to Nigeria, is a critical view of what you might have learned in secondary school, but you did not really have the opportunity to critically analyze, right? So when in 1914 Nigeria became a colonial entity, unified by Britain, we start to see that the concept of, a Nigerian economy starts to be formed, right? And honestly, you can't even really talk about like this formation without talking about one particular company as at that point, the Royal Niger Company Chartered and Limited. So let's go back to the 19th century. The Royal Niger Company, was a mercantile company that was chartered by the British government in the 19th century. Mercantile companies were just primarily focused on engaging, importing and exporting goods. They were importer, exporter, number one. Sorry. Companies like this were instrumental in expanding the British Empire. How? The British Empire, chartered, simply like the British government, allowed them to officially do trade within the regions that the British government licensed them to do trade in. And why was this important for the British government? Well, it was important for the British government because if you can remember, it wasn't only Britain that was trying to get Africa. There was France and there was Germany. Like Otto Bismarck was really keen on expanding his territories in the African continent, but because of companies like the Royal Niger Company, Britain was able to somehow protect its own territories and its own interests. So that was really the function of these kinds of companies, right? And there's this guy called Sir Goldie. I'm not really going to talk about him in this podcast, but he's interesting in the history of Nigeria because he was the one that managed Royal Niger Company, and perhaps the reason why the company had to sell off all its assets and just its own territories to the British government, as at the point whereby they sold to the British government, they had about 30 trading posts, which is a lot even for the standards of that days. And so that was how Nigeria was sold for £865,000 by the Royal Niger Company to Britain. You might be asking yourself, why is this important? Like, why is this relevant here? It's relevant because this is what creates the economic history of Nigeria. And just after this process, right, that we now start to see that the British government talking about banking activities in Nigeria, and the banking activities conversation and just the thought process in Nigeria, started from the GD Payton report, and this report literally started analyzing, is it good for us to technically have banking within Nigeria, colonial Nigeria as at that point. And the report found out that, why not? It will be beneficial because that way you'll be able to control the banking activities in the country. And how are you essentially going to control banking activities in colonial Nigeria? By creating a central bank. And this honestly is where this context is important, because after Nigeria was sold to the British government, the conversations around banking activities started from G.D. Payton, and that resulted by 1958 to the creation of the Central Bank of Nigeria. That is the CBN under the Central Bank Act of 1958. As early as April 1960, the Central Bank had already started issuing treasury bills and defining the guidelines for the operations of banks within Nigeria. So Nigeria had gotten independence at that point, so we can technically call it Nigeria as a country and not a colonial entity, right? And it is really from there that interest rates in itself, though at that point they were not called the monetary policy rates, that's the imperial, it was there that the framework in quotes of and the idea, right, of interest rates and banking activity started evolving in Nigeria. But this is context. This is what I wanted you to learn from a historical point of view. Again, the economic history of Nigeria, very rapidly, a crash course I just gave you now. But it is good that you have this in mind, because it will help us, especially when you look at the function. As I said, central banks are created, and in this case in Nigeria, we also saw that the central banks were created for what? For the reason of managing banking activities, but they prove more important in our condition now because of interest rates, which is a huge theme in this data story that I'm going to talk about. You know what, guys? Let's take a break and then sip a cup of tea before we go further. Okay. I think you should do likewise. Get something you like to drink and you should listen, because this is actually where we will start going deep into inflation in Nigeria. Now that you know the context, let's look at the inflation properly. I will start from the CBN's own official release data, just so as to avoid any speculation or non-backed, data-backed analysis, right? And there are certain metrics you can use to really see why the prices of goods and services are increasing or decreasing in Nigeria. And like this honestly can be broken down into 4 factors. So the first factor is the monetary factor. Second factor is the market factor. The third factor are interest rates, and then there are other factors such as treasury bills, savings deposits, and deposit rates and lending rates. The monetary factors include like money supply issues, like money supply matrix, and money supply components. This, if you check the CBN, right, they measure narrow money supply M2 and money supply M3. The overall, all of this just measures the overall amount of money circulating in the economy. A rapid increase in money supply can lead to inflation if it outpaces economic growth, as there are more naira chasing the same goods and services. Then under monetary factors, we also have net foreign assets, net domestic credit to the government, credit to private sector, and base money. Under the market factors, we have currency in circulation and bank reserves. Under interest rates, we have interbank call rates, the minimum with discount rates, that's the MRR, the monetary policy rate, the MPR. And we will be focusing on the MRR and the MPR in this data story. The MPR more than the MRR, and I'll explain why shortly. Some of these things affect the naira directly, and some of them, the factors I've mentioned affect the naira indirectly. Of all the factors, it is only the interest rate. And when I say the interest rate, I mean like the MPR in itself and the interbank call rate that can directly affect inflation. And as I've already explained, the focus of this data story will be the MPR and its connection to inflation, and how these two things essentially drive down to the rise in bread and rise in gari that affects the average Nigerian. It's also important to note what exactly is the mandate of the CBN. And why is this important? Because that drives what is the CBN's goal and the CBN's actions. The first mandate that the CBN has, that overall objective, the first of it, is to actually ensure monetary and price stability. And technically, you cannot ensure price stability unless you are able to influence the inflation of a country. And for that reason, right, the CBN is instrumental and important when you're talking about inflation. But then you might start asking yourself, is there really a correlation between MPR and inflation rate in Nigeria? Well, the answer to this question is actually what we're trying to show, or what I'm trying to show, right? And according to a study in 2019 by the Department of Banking and Finance in the Niger Delta State University, they argue that there's a causal relationship between the interest rate and the broad money supply, exchange rate, MPR, treasury bill, reserve requirements, etc. Basically, they're saying that yes, there is a correlation between the MPR, that's the monetary policy rate, and the inflation. But their study is quite limited in the sense of it starts from 2009 but ends at 2017. And for me, that was a problem. Why was it a problem? Well, it was a problem because, for me, it doesn't really give sufficient background to actually understand where are we coming from. And, this data story has a bigger scope because it starts from 2006 and it looks all the way to 2024. Yes, 2024 up until February. So in terms of understanding inflation and understanding what exactly is going on, I think this will give you better context than those studies. To actually help me in this story, in telling an informed decision, an informed story, and a data-driven story, I'll be using not just the MPR and the inflation rates. Please, guys, remember that the MPR is the monetary policy rate, because I'll be saying MPR a lot in this conversation. So the MPR, the inflation rate, the foreign exchange rate, and the GDP data is what I'll be using to actually tell a data-driven story. And using these 4 data points, I will be checking the relevant connections for between 2006 and 2024, and I'll be trying to basically go further than that study by the Niger Delta University in 2019 did. We must be careful to think that correlation of something is causation, because different factors might contribute in affecting certain things, right? And as a result, right, it is always necessary to look at data in its context. And like for everything I'll be saying here, please remember that the context is important, like where we're starting from, which period you are in is also important. Also for this story, just to make the analysis as straightforward as possible, right, I have also organized the patterns, like the sequences of or the periods from 2006 to 2023 in story plots, and I've organized it in 5 different story plots. The first story plot, or story plot 1, is from June 2006 to December 2007. The second story plot is from February 2009 to January 2013. The third story plot is from September 2015 to August 2017. The fourth story plot is from February 2020 to January 2022, whilst the fifth story plot is from May 2022 and December 2023. Why did I choose these sections? Because they are the most obvious sections where you look at the data, like they stand out immediately, and I'll explain why they stand out shortly, but these are really the areas that you want to study when you're studying inflation in Nigeria, because it really gives you the relevant information and the relevant guide you need to knowing why we are here. Why did I call them story plots? I mean, it adds to the drama. I can't even lie. It actually adds to just the dramatic effect of inflation in Nigeria today. It's kind of like Chino Achibe, or like a Wole Soyinka play at this point. Just sounds and gongs and sounds of drums left and right, because some things just do not make sense. So of course it's a story, because it looks like cruise and vibes at this point. So let's just follow the energy of inflation, I would say. Housekeeping rules, guys. Before we go any further, just get your favorite drink. As I've said, I have my tea beside me, and I'm drinking it because I need tea, and it's night, and it's hot, and it's a bit cold where I am, so I need to drink something that allows me to speak clearly. So do the same for you, and please do not just listen to the story first. Put your opinions on one side. Listen to the story as if you are new. When I say the story, I mean like the story plots, right? As if you are new and this is the first time I listen to it, because that's the only way you'll be able to, critically analyze it and critically know if what I'm saying is absolute BS or if it's actually relevant. Now that we know that, well, let's go ahead and start digging in from 2006. Story plot 1, that was from June 2006 to December 2007. The first thing you would immediately notice from plot 1 is that from January to November 2006, there was no MPR rates. Like, it's zero, nada. It's actually not an error, honestly. Let me explain. So before November 2006, the CBN did not really have the MPR. Again, what is the MPR? Monetary Policy Rate. I'm not going to say it again. What existed before the MPR was the MRR. Remember the MRR? Yes, the minimum rediscount rate. So before the MPR was created, right, the MRR was what was considered the official interest rate of the CBN up until November 2006. But how exactly, you might be asking yourself, does interest rate affect the economy, right? Let me explain shortly. Generally, when the interest rates of the country is increased or decreased four major things equally increase or decrease. Some of the things I'm saying here overlap, if you remember, with the four factors I mentioned just like some minutes earlier, but this is how the CBN explains it. So I think it's quite important to look at the logic of the CBN when we're actually analyzing the influence of interest rates in the economy. So according to the CBN, this rise in interest rates affects the market interest rates. What that means is like the interest rates that banks will give you loans for, or well, I don't know about your loan apps. I don't know if you qualify, because some of those guys are just a bit predatory, but like, yeah, your loan apps too. The asset prices as well, it's being influenced by the interest rates, also the expectations and confidence of the markets, like economic agents regarding the economy. That is, people that are betting on the Nigerian economy to do well so that they'll get profits, or those that are betting on the Nigerian economy to go bad so that they will make profits. If you think there are no guys betting against this economy, there are people that that benefit from the Nigerian economy not doing as great. But that's not the point of today's conversation. And then finally, we have the exchange rates. So these four things, according to the CBN, influence the internal and external demand of goods and services, which creates inflationary pressures or reduces it, thereby leading to inflation in itself. When we say inflationary pressures, what we mean, are the things that actually push for inflation to happen, or things that deflate or reduce inflation from happening. When we're talking about the exchange rates, according to CBN, it can lead to higher or lower import prices from goods you buy outside Nigeria. When you're bringing it in, there's a price you have to pay. So those prices, depending on the interest rates, can either go up or down as well, right? And this also leads to inflation, because if somebody brought goods into Nigeria and they're selling it in the Nigerian market, they will pass that tariff or whatever price has been raised, right, to the final consumer, which is you in this case. Simply then, like anytime the government literally announces a change or a decrease in MPR, one of these, these things are moving. That's market interest rates, the asset prices, expectation and confidence of the market, and then the exchange rate goes up and down, and that is actually how inflation will be influenced. So again, before 2006, there was no MPR per se. There was the MRR, but from December 2006, the MPR was created. Now let's look at whether the MPR from 2006 was actually influencing inflation. So in December 2006, the MPR, that's the monetary policy rate, was increased for the first time to 10% when the inflation was 8.5%. It is clear that the MPR affected the inflation rate in this period, as inflation declined drastically from 8.5% to 4.6% just 5 months later. That is in May 2007. If you remember, the presidential elections which saw Musa Obed become president also happened in April 2007. The CBN decided to decrease the MPR to 8%, which made borrowing less expensive in June 2007, because they were sensing that inflation was under control and under their reserve money targets of 860 billion naira. This, however, led to a 2% increase in the inflation rate to 6.4%. So in October 2007, right, the rates increased once more to 9%, because there was excess liquidity of 119 billion naira relative to the CBN's target of 880 billion naira, which was caused by an increase in currency circulation in the economy. That is, just more money than the CBN wanted flowing in the Nigerian economy. Despite these efforts, however, like in October 2007, inflation kept rising from 4.1% to 6.6% by December of 2007, when the MPR was increased to 9.5% in anticipation of excess liquidity. From a foreign exchange standpoint, everything was relatively stable during the course of the entire months of June 2006 to December 2007. Compared to the euro and the pounds, the sterling pounds, the dollar was much more stable, as it averaged 125 naira for each US dollar. That is, for each US dollar that you wanted, you had to give 125 naira. That was the average exchange rate, between June 2006 to December 2007. Surprisingly, the naira gained relative to the dollar, by 9.5 naira. Yes, as in the dollar began at 126.7 naira in June 2006, but by the time we get to December 2007, the dollar was actually 117.2 naira to the dollar, which is probably one of the fewest times that you ever see that happen. God forbid, I hope that in the future we'll see situations like this. But anyways, the naira fell slightly relative to the euro and the pound. The naira lost a value of 10.5 naira for each euro and 6.6 naira for each pound in the same period. That was June 2006 to December 2007. When we look at the GDP, right, and when I mean GDP, I'm talking about real GDP only for this data story, not nominal GDP. In 2006, the services sector contributed the most, 17.78% to the GDP. This was followed by the industry and agricultural sectors. The industry sector contributed 13.8%, whilst the agricultural sector contributed 10.6% to the real GDP. Crude petroleum and natural gas sector, made up just 9.2% of the GDP. In 2007, the contribution of the services sector increased to 19.04%, followed by industry, but industry declined to 12.9%, and agriculture increased to 10.8%. The real GDP increased by 5.4%, while it increased by 13.7% per capita between 2006 and 2007. Essentially, what's the main story in plot 1? That is June 2006 to December 2007. The main story is that the economy was actually responsive to the CBN's interest rate changes, that is the MPR. The MPR going up saw inflation and excess liquidity reduce marginally. We also saw that the MPR was increased just before the presidential election to reduce inflation. This might not necessarily be a causation, but there was a clear correlation. By the end of the entire story, I will allow you to determine whether there are enough instances of these situations happening. That is, just before a presidential election, you increase the interest rate a bit just so that, you can tame inflation. I won't judge that. You will judge that. Because right now, I'm going to the next story plot, which is story plot 2, February 2009 to January 2013. This story plot, right, starts with a pretty high inflation rate of 14.6% and an MPR of 9.75% in February 2009. 2 months later, that's in April, the MPR was reduced to 8%, and by May 2009, a new CBN governor was appointed. Guess who? Yes, Sanusi Lamido Sanusi. Before becoming the CBN governor, however, Lamido Sanusi was the CEO of First Bank of Nigeria. Just, for extra context, guys, the First Bank of Nigeria is the only bank who has had 2 of its past CEOs as CBN governors. The first was Joseph Oladele Sanusi, who governed the CBN from 1999 to 2006. So, extra context. Having 2 Sanusis as CBN governor, beat that if you can. Anyways, the April reduction of the MPR also reflected in the inflation rate, as the inflation fell to 11.2% from 13.32%. By July, the MPR was further decreased to 6%, and this, rate lasted for 13 months. That is, this MPR rate lasted till August 2010. Inflation went a bit crazy during that period, but it's very important to note that there were a lot of factors that might have influenced this. If you remember, in 2010, many people were kind of worried, because they were not sure what was happening to President Musa Obed, and this sent mixed signals both economically and politically. As we all know, in May 2010, President Yar'Adua died, leading to a rapid change in leadership by President Goodluck Jonathan taking over, who was previously the vice president. Now, when the MPR was decreased to 6% in July 2009, inflation initially decreased to 10.4% from its initial 11.1% just 2 months after. From October 2009, however, inflation kept increasing till it hit a peak of 15.6% in February 2010. Guys, in case you're following this and you're like, this is so many percent, don't worry. After each story plot, I gave a summary just so that it's clear what exactly I've been talking about. And if you really want to make sure you understand, just play it back, listen to it, and then listen to like the conclusions of each story plot. Or like as you're listening to this, you should watch the graphs and look at the graphs that's on my LinkedIn page again, Musa Obed. But anyways, going back to story plot 2, what exactly caused the inflation getting high in October 2009 and hitting a peak of 15.6%? Well, the CBN did not change it for they did not increase the MPR for several reasons. The first is that they introduced quantitative easing of 500 billion naira to bridge the gap between the monetary aggregates and its benchmark levels for 2009. And the second reason is because an asymmetric corridor of interest rates around the MPR was introduced. Now, quantitative easing is a monetary strategy that is used by central banks. When central banks use this strategy, they buy up, securities, that's government bonds and other financial instruments, with the ultimate goal of reducing interest rates and increasing the supply of money in the economy. The asymmetric corridor, on the other hand, of interest rates occurs when the CBN sets two different interest rates for when commercial banks deposit money to the CBN and when they borrow money from the CBN. The point is that the CBN wants to make banks lend more than just storing their money. They want to make banks incentivize them in a way, right, to lend more of their money than just keeping it as deposits with the CBN. So in this way, they are able to allow for like activity to happen within the economy. This corridor, that's this asymmetric corridor, to incentivize commercial banks or disincentivize them depending on the time, allows the CBN to adjust the rewards for depositing money and the cost for borrowing money from the CBN. Because of these different interest rates, a short window where short-term interest rates fluctuates become created immediately. Don't worry, this is a bit technical, so you don't really need to have this in mind. The effect of the CBN's quantitative easing was delayed by May 2010, but by 6 months after inflation reduced to 13%, the CBN then increased the MPR to 6.25% in September 2010, leading to a period of reduced inflation from 13.6% in September 2010 to 11.1% in February 2011. The inflation rate decreased further in 2011, reducing to 9.3% in August because the interest rate was increased to 7.5% in March and then 8.75% in July. In this same period, the Nigerian presidential elections happened, seeing the introduction of Goodluck Jonathan as the constitutionally elected president in 2011. Guess what? Again, just like in 2007, a relatively higher interest rate resulted in reduced inflation around the presidential election month. Correlation strike too. I leave it up to you. In October, the CBN decided to further increase the interest rate to 12%, the highest since the MPR's first introduction in 2006. The reason the CBN gave for this increase was that the increase was, in quotes, in response to unusual developments in the global and domestic economy with potential negative impact on domestic liquidity conditions and renewed threat to price and exchange rate stability. I mean, honestly speaking, this made sense due to the August 2011 stock market crash that was triggered by the debt crisis in Europe and then the bust in the US credit rating that resulted in the loss of $1 trillion in the stock markets on that particular day. This led to in Nigeria an average inflation of 11.7% in the country from October 2011 to January 2013, as the MPR remained unchanged at 12%. When we look at the FX story, what does plot 2 tell us? Well, plot 2, show that there was a slow but steady decrease of the naira relative to the dollar, euro, and pounds also. In February 2009, $1 could be exchanged for 148.8 naira. The naira, however, lost its value, and by January 2013, Nigerians needed 155 naira to get $1. This is the same story for euros and pounds, as Nigerians needed 182.2 naira to get €1 at the beginning of this plot. That is February 2009. But by the end of plot 2, you needed 205.8 naira to get that same €1. For pounds, Nigerians needed 204.7 naira to get a pound at the beginning of the plot, the storyline. That is in February 2009, and by January 2013, that's the end of this plot, right? Nigerians needed 253 naira to buy that same £1. The naira fell by 20.6 naira relative to the euro, while it fell by 48 naira relative to the pound. The average dollar rate, that is the average you could have exchanged dollar between February 2009 and January 2013, was 150 naira for each dollar. When we look at real GDP, just to contextualize a bit more, we see that the services sector contributed the most on average at 22.16%. This was followed by industry at 11.22%, and then the agricultural sector at 10.4%. The average contribution of crude petroleum and natural gas in that same period, right, was 6.2%, declining from its original 8.7% from the first plot that we saw, right, in the 2006 to December 2007 period. It was not only the crude petroleum that declined, natural gas, it was not only the crude petroleum sector that declined, as like agriculture and industry also declined in this particular period, that is February 2009 to January 2013. Anyways, a lot of percent. What is the main point of January to February 2009 to January 2013? The main point of plot 2, this period, is that the economy was slow to respond to interest rates, but it did respond, as we saw inflation reducing gradually after each CBN interest rate increase. That is, each time the MPR went up, it was slow, but inflation came down eventually. In this particular plot, right, from February to December 2013, the quantitative easing, the 500 billion naira that was injected to buy up securities, was able to control inflation, and that was practically why the CBN did not raise interest rates between 2009 and 2010. What's more, we also see that the FX was much worse than in 2006 to 2007, as the naira lost more of its value relative to the dollar, the euro, and the pound. For real GDP, what should you remember for this plot? The services sector was still the biggest contributor to the economy, and was the one that grew on average, and this suggests that it has a certain element of robustness that allows it to just be survive in tough situations, especially in a context like Nigeria. Again, perhaps I'm not trying to suggest anything, but this is the second time that the MPR was increased just before a presidential election period, and that resulted to inflation, right? And why is this a thing? Like, why is this a big deal? Well, because if inflation goes down, technically for that period, people are like, situations are getting better now. So if you are the incumbent and that's the move you made, well, it's like scoring points for yourself, because you'll be like, guys, I told you I'm working, like food prices down. You can now go to Mama Tope and go and get gari for 300 naira now. Before it used to be 500, but look at, it's 300 naira now. And then a month later, 2 months later, you go to the polls and you're like, yes, like, is actually working, or she's actually working, whereby MPR was increased for that particular purpose. 2 correlations, plus 1 in 2007 and also in 2011. So you make out of it what you want. Let's move on to the next story plot, which is, the period between September 2013 and August 2017. The CBN reduced the MPR to 11% in November 2015, sensing that the previous 13% MPR had sufficiently tamed inflation. By February 2016, however, the inflation rate started increasing gradually from 11.38% till it hit a peak of 18.7% in January 2017. This was the highest rate inflation had reached since 2006. This inflationary pressure led the CBN to increase the MPR first by 12% in March 2016 to 14% in July 2016. In anticipation of a sudden reduction in the value of the Naira, the Emefiele-led CBN had allowed for more flexibility in the interbank FX market structure so as to allow a window for critical transactions in May 2006. This seemed to do very little, really, for the sharp decline in the value of the Naira in July 2016. Why? Because between June and July, the Naira lost 85 Naira against each dollar, it lost 94 Naira against each euro, and it lost 91 Naira against each pound. This loss is the value, this loss in the value of the Naira can be considered, what I have termed, for this story, the cause of the pre-modern beginning of a very weak Naira. Guys, it is very important that you remember this, right? September 2015 to August 2017, that's 3+3 is what I call, the cause of the pre-modern beginning of a very weak Naira. Why is this important to remember? Well, you'll find out at the end, but just hold it in mind. Pre-modern beginning, just, story plot 3. Pre-modern beginning 2015-2017. Anyways, the MPR at 14% did, however, have its impact on the inflation rate within this period, as the inflation slowly declined to 16% by August 2017, further showing that the Nigerian economy tends to respond, even though slowly, to MPR increases. The Naira, on the other hand, regained its value. Between the plot 3 period, the Naira lost a total of 108 Naira against each dollar. That is, you needed 108 Naira more by August 2017 to get $1 relative to September 2015. For Euro, the Naira fell by 139 Naira, whilst this was 101 Naira for the pounds. I'm going to talk about the reasons why the Naira fell so much in September 2015 to August 2017. But let me take another sip of tea, please. So, 2 reasons. To correct myself, I had previously said that the Naira gained, that in quotes, the Naira had regained its value as at this point. Well, technically yes, but it slowly went back again to chaos, as you will soon see, right? And these are the 2 reasons I'll be pointing out. Like, why did the Naira lose so much value between September 2015 and August 2017? Well, number 1, Nigeria experienced its first recession in over 2 decades in 2016, as the economy contracted by 1.6% due to falling oil prices and a shock in production in the country. Number 2, at the same time, the newly elected president, that is President Buhari, was confronted with an insecurity situation, starting from terrorism, that was led by Boko Haram, and which was created like nearly a decade earlier, to also kidnapping and the herdsmen farmers crisis. The Nigerian security tracker, which is a tracker that was created by the Council of Foreign Relations, estimated that over 8,000 Nigerians were killed for insecurity reasons within this period. If you remember that period, unfortunately in Benue State, 767 people died. And this was, much higher in Borno State at 4,675 deaths for these people. May their souls rest in peace. when we look at the real GDP for this period, that is September 2015 to August 2017, what we see is that the services sector continued to grow. It remained resilient on average, right? And between September 2015 to August 2017, it grew by 23.6%. Agriculture was the second biggest contributor to the GDP, and it grew by 10.7%. Or contributed, to the GDP by 10.7%. And the crude petroleum sectors just continued to decline to 10.1% in that same period. To 3.9%, in that same period. It was the industry that declined to 10.1% in that period. Anyways, long grammar, what is the point? Well, the main point of story plot 3, that is September 2015 to August 2017, is that 1, the MPR is capable of taming inflation again, but at a very slow pace. 2, the loss in the value of the naira in July 2016, driven by an economic recession, can be considered, the cause of the pre-modern beginning of a very weak naira. I said again, guys, that you should remember this statement, the pre-modern beginning, because there will be 2 more statements that will allow us to further understand what is happening in 2024. The third thing you should note, right, the main important lesson from plot 3, that is September 2015 to 2017, August 2017, right? The third thing you should know is that inflation reached its highest point since 2006. It reached 18.7% in January 2017. The fourth thing you should know is that the naira finally passed the 200 naira threshold, like 200 naira to $1 threshold, by July 2016. That was when the recession was happening. And finally, what you remember between September 2015 to August 2017, well, that the services and agricultural sectors tend to grow amidst economic challenges in Nigeria, whilst the industry and crude petroleum sector tend to contract or contribute less in terms of real GDP to Nigeria. Let's move on to story plot 4. Story plot 4 is when COVID happened, and also when we had another recession. But let's get there slowly. So story plot 4 covers February 2020 to January 2022. Now, Nigeria started 2022 with 2-digit inflation. That is, when people say 2-digit inflation, literally what it means. It's more than 10. Any inflation rate that is more than 10, it's double digits, because less than 10, you're singular digits, right? Okay, that's clear. Anyways, when Nigeria started 2022, right, the inflation rate was 12.2% by February 2020. This was majorly because of the extension of the 2 factors that I highlighted, right, in the previous